Thank you for joining us today on Positively Charged Biz. We are here to motivate, inspire, and support our listeners as they write their life stories. We are a proud founding member of the Real Disrupt Podcast Collaborative, and you can check out more awesome podcasts at realdisrupt.com. Hey everyone, I hope you are having a positive and productive day. On today's show, we are joined by an amazing lady who is going to help us understand that we can be okay with who we are and still be successful in our personal and professional lives. Allow me to introduce you all to Dr. Kathleen Smith. She is a licensed therapist and the author of the new book, Everything Isn't Terrible: Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. A graduate of Harvard University and George Washington University, she's written for popular websites like New York Magazine, Life Hacker, Everyday Health, Psychology Today, Counseling Today, and many other. Interviews with Kathleen have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Women's Health Magazine, Women's World Magazine, and television programs, including Good Morning Washington. Kathleen writes a free weekly therapy newsletter on managing anxiety called The Anxious Overachiever. Kathleen, we are thrilled that you are here with us today. And on Positively Charged Biz, we like to start at the beginning. So please tell us, why did you decide to focus on helping the anxious overachiever?
Well, first of all, I live in Washington, D.C., which is full of anxious people and full of overachievers. So business-wise, it's a smart decision, I think.
You were focusing in on your market, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I looked around and said, what are the people who are around me and what are their problems? And I found that they were very similar to my own, fortunately. Because, I grew up being an overachiever. I was so fueled by getting praise from my teachers in school or doing well in school. I did very well. I was the first person in my hometown to ever get into Harvard. And I got there and I couldn't be the best anymore. And I had to look around and go, okay, well, I've got to find some other way to get validation and to think about who I want to be, because that's not always an option. And so, my journey of growing up and calming down, and I'm still very much on it, is to figure out how to be driven by the inside out and not how to be driven by achieving or getting praise or approval from other people. And that's a really hard thing to do, I think, for a lot of us.
I think that's a very difficult thing. So don't leave us hanging there. We want you to keep going, because believe me, we're in the mortgage industry and we're literally told every single day, you're only as good as your last deal. Like literally, we are driven by that excitement of bringing those families home, which is a true honor and a privilege of what we get to do every day and make a difference in people's lives. But you're always chasing. You're chasing that next family that you're going to help. You're chasing that deadline. You have to close by the end of the month. You have, this family has nowhere to live. You have to get this done. So we're always chasing that fulfillment. So now tell us, go backwards, where you said it has to start from the inside out. After being conditioned that way from when we're a child, like you mentioned, okay, in school, you're getting good grades, or you're in sports and you're winning, so we're conditioned right from when we're children that you're always looking for that praise. So how do you start to work on the inside?
Yeah, I think it's such a part of the culture, like you say, that people are supposed to operate like businesses. And that's an unachievable task in my mind, because we're going to have life events, and things that disrupt our achieving, or we're just going to have bad years or years where we're not as productive because of life events or things out of our control, right? And so, I think there's nothing wrong with feeling more confident, feeling capable, feeling happy because you're making things happen, and you're being successful in your work. But you have to have other things that prop up your sense of self than just getting confidence and calmness from your career or from that external stuff, right? Because if you don't, your life is going to be a roller coaster. You're going to have highs when you're doing well, and then the lows are going to be really steep and really hard. So people have got to have a good sense of what they believe, what they value, that isn't, outside of their control. It's something that they can actually focus on and make happen. And so much of our work is out of our control. It is dependent on variables that are just outside us.
So what would an example of that be? Okay, so give me an example of what we should make sure is intertwined into our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, to give my own work for an example, you could evaluate my work by how many therapy clients I have, right? Or how long my wait list is, or what I charge people, or things like that, right? But I can also evaluate my work by how I treat other people, how I treat myself. What are the guiding ideas and principles that I use to do the work, right? And those are all things that I can control. So that at the end of the day, maybe if I don't have as many clients, or I'm not as busy as I maybe was in a previous period of time, I can look and say, you know what, I showed up. I treated people the way I think they should be treated. I did good thinking. I was kind of performing my best in that way, because those were the variables I could control. I was sort of embodying my idea of what it is to be my best self. And if I can stay focused on that, then A, I'm probably going to have some successes, but B, on the days of the weeks where things aren't where I would like them to be, my mood's not going to crash. I'm not going to feel hopeless or be self-critical, right? And that helps me, continue to do well. So I think it's not that you don't value achieving. It's just that you're more strategic, and you say, you know what, if I invest in myself and my own thoughts and beliefs, it's actually going to be the best for me in the long run.
I love that. And that's great. And it's interesting. I recently attended a virtual mastermind that I was part of. And people were writing comments constantly saying, I'm new to this. What are the secrets of success? How do I build my pipeline? How do I grow my business? And a lot of what you just said, it's interesting that a lot of the people that spoke, and they were wonderful women, part of my women's mortgage network, a lot of them that spoke, they said, well, it's all about planting those seeds. And a lot of what you just said, it's the taking the time to develop those relationships. It's doing business the way that you want to do business, right? That it's not necessarily selling someone, or it's not necessarily going after it that way. It's really truly taking care of them. And that's part of what you were just saying. Even if you're not necessarily achieving that plateau at that moment, you're doing it your way. You're sending out those little cards. You're forming those relationships. You're taking care of those families. And usually that does equate to achieving down the road, but it also is being true to yourself and feeling that sense of fulfillment while you're doing that and working towards that achievement. So I love that. That's great. That's a great way to kind of pull it all together. Okay. So you mentioned calming. All right. So I want to hear from you. How do we actually have the ability to calm ourselves, especially when we're in this growth mentality?
Yeah, so I think the first thing when you think about how do I sort of have a calmer existence, how do I do calmer work, is this idea of what do I do to calm myself down that isn't actually who I want to be? Because I think we do a lot of things to manage our anxiety and the stress that kind of come back to haunt us a little bit in the long run. If your way of staying calm is to overfunction for your family, for your colleagues, for clients, and when I use the word overfunction, that means to be over responsible and do things for them, direct them, take over, try and control, right? That might calm you down, but then that's what leads to burnout, right? That is what a short-term solution causes long-term problems, right? Or another way a person might calm down is to avoid their work, or to avoid having contact with people, to email somebody when you really need to give them a phone call, right? And that is a way of calming yourself down. but that is not most people's definition of doing good work, or embodying some of those, ideals and ideas that we just talked about. And so, I think the first place you start is just to ask yourself, what do I usually do to calm myself down? And first of all, has that been effective? And does that represent the person I'm trying to be? Is there a better way, or a kinder way to myself that doesn't look like being responsible for everybody, or being scared or intimidated or distant, right? I just give those two examples, but I think so much of what we do to stay calm and stable, it's really not that effective, if that makes sense.
It actually makes total sense. And I think as women, I think a lot of times that is our reaction, because we do jump into nurture and take care and make things better, right? Like all of a sudden we're jumping in to save the day and make everybody else feel better. And we think that's our sense of calm, but yet it causes a ripple down the road. So I can totally appreciate that. And that does make sense. So what should we be looking to do? Like, what is an example of a positive way to calm ourselves down in those situations?
Well, to give you an example, I think, I work as a writer as well. And I notice that when I get very anxious, I will overestimate, or I guess overestimate. Let me say this a different way. When an editor asks me for a deadline, I will tell them the date that I think that they want. So I will lie to myself and to them and say, I can get this sooner to you than what is actually possible, right? And so in the short term, that calms me down, because I think I have given them what they want, right? And so that's me not being realistic about how much work I can accomplish in a week, right? But that ends up making me much more anxious, because all of a sudden I have this deadline and 27,000 other things to do, right? And I maybe don't do as good of a job. So I have sort of sacrificed good work for that temporary calmness of making another person happy. And I think that, especially women, but I think a lot of people can relate to this, whatever their work is that there is this pressure to not be realistic about what we can get done in a day or in a week. If it's the pressure to calm down a client, to calm down a colleague, we lose sight of that reality. I think that's one of the first things that happens. And so, for me, that means I have to be temporarily uncomfortable and anxious with the honesty, saying, you know what, I can't get this to you by Monday. It's going to take a couple extra days. But in the long term, I actually end up being calmer because I have been honest with myself and with other people. But, that's the catch. It's going to make you a little bit uncomfortable, maybe, to do what you normally wouldn't do, because it might upset people. It might not be what they want. But over time, I think it is better for your relationships with the people you work with and the people you work for, to kind of lead with that honesty. So that's just one example I think of.
That is a great example. That is a really, really good example, especially in our industry where we are so time focused.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is, if it took you 1 second, it's longer than anybody wanted to wait. Everything is time generated, and it's difficult. And you're right. We we tend to, sure, we'll make that happen, and you're right. That moment that you say that, it feels good, because you give them exactly what they wanted to hear. But then the pressure's on, and the anxiety is building, and all of that is happening. So that actually is a very good example of, okay, setting proper expectations and maybe being uncomfortable with saying that at first, but in the long run, it keeps everything calmer and more attainable. So it does better work, right? So we know the work is going to be done at the right level, no errors, everything is done properly, and everyone has proper expectations. So great advice. Okay, so I'm curious, I've seen that, especially, this year, everybody's had numerous different levels of anxiety for many different reasons. But how important is it to have a community or a tribe to actually be able to have open conversations and realize that you're not the only one feeling this anxiety.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the more anxious we get, the more we pull back and distance ourselves. Because if we start to talk about our challenges, it might make the other person anxious, or they might start talking about theirs, and that'll make us feel anxious, right? So it's sort of this, we're kind of allergic to each other the more worked up we get. And so then, with the people we care about, with our family or with colleagues, with other people, what tends to happen is we gravitate towards more superficial conversations, or we just don't talk as much, or at all, right? And so to me, part of learning to calm down is learning to manage your own anxiety when you talk to people about anxious things. And being able to share your thinking, to be able to be honest about what you're up against and how hard it is, and letting other people have the opportunity to share that as well. And it can be difficult to hear people talk about their challenges, because I think for many of us, the instinct is to want to calm them down, to want to tell them what to do or to give advice, or to say, you know what, I can't handle this. It's making me too anxious, right? And so just being in contact with people, but staying focused on, you know what, I'm responsible for myself, not for everybody else. And I think about this a lot as a therapist. If somebody comes to, I'm working with them and they're very worked up and anxious, and I'm sure you all work with lots of anxious people.
We have a lot of anxious people.
People are anxious and excited and worried and all those emotions, right? And so we gravitate towards reassuring them, taking responsibility for their anxiety. And I think we forget that if you're able to stay calm and thoughtful, that is so much more helpful to a person than you trying to take over and manage their distress. And so I think we forget how much power is in that, and that people respond to it, that it is just as, the calmness is just as contagious as the stress. And I have much more control over myself than somebody else's emotions. And so I think, when you're reaching out, to your tribe, as you say, or to a community of people, just to remember that you're, unless it's your kid, like, you're only responsible for yourself. And that the way to be a resource to people is just to calm down. And who doesn't love a calm person?
Listen, that your advice is spot on, and I love it. But I'm seeing, just from what I've witnessed over the last so many months, you're 100% correct. People withdraw, right? People, their automatic is, okay, I'm going to stay away from that person because there's too much drama, right? There's too much drama going on over there. I can't deal with their drama because their drama will make me have a higher level of anxiety. How do you keep yourself calm when this person, whoever, whatever people are just coming at you with this burden of drama? How do you keep yourself thinking calmly when that's coming at you? What's a good exercise for that?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things I do. One thing I do is I kind of scale it. I say, on a scale of 1 to 100, how intense does this person feel? And if they're an 80, can I be a 70? You don't have to shoot super high, but just say, let me make sure I'm at least a little bit calmer than the person engaging me, And the other thing I try and remember is, and I do this a lot, obviously, as a therapist, but just to keep asking questions, because I think we gravitate towards, well, have you tried this? Or giving advice, right? Instead of saying, oh, that's tough. What do you think you're going to do? Or just getting more details from the person. And that if you're able to maybe engage a little bit of curiosity, I think it's easier to do if it's somebody you care about, somebody whose life you're invested in. You help them do their thinking. To me, it's like when we're anxious, we use this back part of the brain that's very old. That's the fight or flight, right?
Oh, the whole reptilian.
Exactly. But when we use the front part of our brain, that's the thinking, the problem solving. And if you start using this part, it is much easier for the other person to start using it as well. And maybe they might get a little bit interested as well. Maybe they start thinking and they're just not sort of word vomiting their anxiety all
Yep.
over.
That's exactly what I was picturing
Yeah.
when I was describing it. Yes.
You know,
And that really is great advice, the questions.
Mhm.
That's a wonderful way to look at it, because I mean, I've known even myself, if we're in a very difficult situation, the more time you spend asking questions and having that dialogue, you almost can feel yourself have a level of calm. You almost can feel it coming down, right? Because the more you're speaking about it, because you're not feeding into the anxiety. The next thing you know, and it's what you just said, you start using a different part of your brain. All of a sudden now you're using logic and you're being analytical and you're thinking about your responses to the answers to these questions. And it really does start to bring it down. So I think that's fabulous advice to be able to calm people, because you're right. Our initial reaction, how do I help? How do I fix this? How do I give them advice that is going to be phenomenal, that's going to make them feel better?
Or how do I get away from you as quickly as possible?
That too. That too. How do I get off the phone or get out of here? That is exactly right. Okay, so that's good. Spot on. Love it. All right. Now, in your book, you mentioned that before you can change anxious behaviors, you have to know what they are so you can observe, evaluate, and interrupt what's automatic. Explain this.
Yeah, so I think so often we get frustrated and we want to jump in and just react differently in our families and our work. And that's so hard to do because, you know, our reactions to stress and anxiety work to, like we talked about earlier, to a degree, right? They're very locked in and innate. And we shouldn't beat ourselves up for them, you know, and I think if you come at it from a self-critical place, it's very hard to do anything differently. So if you can kind of approach yourself and say, well, let me look at myself like I'm a researcher, you know, or an anthropologist or a biologist watching some animal in the wild, right? And can I get curious, you know, when I talk to a family member, when I talk to a colleague or a client, and see what I do. And then that's the observing, right? And then can I evaluate it? Can I say, you know, does me always taking over, has it been effective? um you know, does it get the outcome I want? If the outcome is I want people to be more responsible and step up, then probably not, right? That just makes them more helpless. You know, does it make me calm down? Yeah, well, temporarily, but then I get really worked up about it. You know, that's that evaluating and asking yourself, well, who is the person I'd like to be? And that usually looks like, well, I'd like to be a person who lets other people be responsible for themselves, who doesn't always jump in and take over, you know, somebody who can sit and watch people maybe do something a little bit less efficiently or more slowly than I would, but that's okay, right? And that's the evaluating. And then the interrupting is, can you look for opportunities to do that? You know, when I always give this example, but like when your spouse is loading the dishwasher the wrong way, can you just let them do it that way if it's not a big deal, right? Or if two people are having a conversation and are kind of having a little bit of conflict, maybe letting them work that out without jumping in and mediating, you know. And that's the uncomfortable part, right? To not do what you would normally do. But I think people, you know, they want to skip to the interrupting. They just want to show up to work or to Thanksgiving and be this totally new person. And it doesn't happen that way. It takes a lot of paying attention and not beating yourself up for doing those kind of automatic behaviors.
Yeah. That definitely takes work to get to
Yeah.
that point.
It's a
But then,
lifetime.
yeah, exactly right. That's right. You're never finished. You're never finished with that work. Absolutely. And that goes back to that right? On the inside and not so much just the achievements. And it's interesting, you know, I mentor a young lady, and we were just having a conversation this week, and she was speaking about this whole getting, you know, literally like a high, right? She gets a high when she achieves something. And I said, you know, that you're on a path that you have to be very careful, because you'll always be searching for that next achievement and that next achievement. And it gets to that point that you almost feel like a failure if you're not getting that next achievement. So what is the best way to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that, you know, I talked about curiosity, you know,
Yeah.
to think about, you know, in your work, what drives you? What is interesting about the work? What would you care about even if nobody praised you or acknowledged you for it? You know, sort of what is intuitively interesting, or what are you curious about? And also, how do you evaluate yourself in a way that's independent from other people's reactions? I mean, feedback is great. It's very important, but you also can evaluate yourself pretty objectively if you give it some practice, you know? So can you end the day, can you end the week and say, what did I do well? What needs some work, you know, without being too hard on yourself, without sugarcoating it either. And I think that sort of internal compass, the more you can kind of strengthen that, you will still feel good when people praise you, and you will still feel bad when people criticize you. But like I said, the highs and the lows aren't as steep, and you won't need that. You won't be kind of chasing that drug of approval as much. And I think that, that takes time, but people seem to do more satisfying work, and they enjoy their work more when they just stick with that internal piece. Because the other stuff is just kind of icing on the cake. It's not the whole cake.
Right, exactly. It's not, you're not getting the sugar high. You don't
Yeah.
need the sugar high. There you go. All right. So the other thing is, speaking of that and approval, social media. I'm curious of, this whole, people getting caught up, especially now, where people are isolated, they're not necessarily out interacting personally, they're spending more time at home and on social media. And I've seen a lot of people struggle with this not feeling worthy, so to speak, because maybe the highlight reels from some other people make it appear that, wow, how can I compare to this? What are your thoughts on how to not feel that way? And how, what's the best way to approach that for someone that's struggling with that?
Yeah, I think people are more likely to feel left out or jealous when they don't have those strong one-to-one relationships with friends, with colleagues. I just think from personal experiences, it's much harder for me to be jealous of a colleague when I'm in conversation with them and we're sharing our challenges with each other. And I know the reality of their life, right? But it's very easy to be jealous of someone if I'm just seeing the highlight reel, right? And so I think that's why it's so important to use times like this, even though if we can't see each other in person, to strengthen those one-to-one relationships and check in with people and talk to people about things that aren't just superficial. And I think it's great with friends and family, but it's also great with your work, because I think that helps your brain, when we miss information, our brain fills in the picture. And it's not usually accurate. It tends to skew very negative, very positive, right? That's sort of it, filling in the what ifs. And so how do you counter that? Well, you counter it with actual information. It requires you to talk to people and see how they're doing and what they're doing and what they think they've done well and what they think their challenges are. And that fills in the pieces so that your imagination doesn't run wild and start saying things like, you're not working as hard as everyone else. This was so much easier for them. Why is it so hard for you? Right? Sort of the lies that our anxiety likes to tell. That to me, that's the only way, is to just be in conversation with people.
Yeah, I think you're correct. And it is so interesting how that happens, right? The minute that there's a moment of open time, people fill it with whatever. I guess it's almost like a protective mode, right? And maybe is it like defensive or something where our mind goes there? I don't know, but it is true that the minute there's open space, that's when people jump to conclusion and they fill it with something else. So that's a good point. And I think you're right. I think a lot of things that you just spoke about, having those true relationships, not superficial, not just, going on the things that don't really matter, the actual discussions. I think that would probably be the biggest recommendation right now, because the more time we spend building those and sharing those relationships, I think that does everyone a world of good. So would that be like, if you were going to give a recommendation, especially during this time where there is heightened anxiety, Would that be the best recommendation for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sometimes called just having a person-to-person relationship, and to ask yourself, who in my family, family especially, who at my work do I not really have a person-to-person relationship with? And that could be important for me. It tends to be people we always find out about them through a third party, right? So you don't have to talk to them face to face, because another relative or another colleague will always tell you how they're doing, right? And that kind
Right.
of keeps you from really kind of getting to know them and talking with them. And I think the more the more people you have a person-to-person relationship, the much harder it is to see them as a villain, or to be jealous of them, or to be reactive towards them, because you have more, like we said, more pieces of the picture. It's easier to see them as human. And I think that that helps you be easier on yourself, but it also helps you have a stronger relationship.
That's wonderful. It's like reading an email. And when you read an email, you kind of put your own voice to it.
Mm-hmm.
And however you're seeing the world at that moment, that's how you read the email. So it's so interesting that, if something not so good just happened and you read it in that tone. But then maybe you just hung up a lovely phone call, and then you're like, oh, that's a happy email. So it's so interesting how our minds can do that. But yet having that conversation or doing a video call, it changes everything. It's clear, it's humanized. All of a sudden it's personal. So it makes a big difference. And you had mentioned that, don't send, oh, I'm afraid to have this conversation, I'll just shoot the email, because that is when you need to have those conversations. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that is one of the challenges with a lot of people working from home, is they don't have that contact. And so it's much easier for people to imagine that their supervisors, their clients, their colleagues are upset with them, or we project all of these emotions onto an email, or a text or whatever. And so that's why that face-to-face, or at least a phone call, is so important.
Absolutely. And keeping our teams connected. It's been so hard that, like you said, so many of us are now working from home, and it's hard. That's that empty piece of time. There's people out there that are jumping to conclusion. Oh, my boss didn't call me today. Oh, they must be mad. I must have done something wrong. And so that human connection, again, it's vital in so many different ways. Absolutely. Kathleen, you have given such wonderful advice. This has been absolutely amazing. So I want two things. So one, I want to have you share how people can find your book, give all your information out there so people can follow you and learn more. And then secondly, if there is anything else that we missed that you just want to share with the audience as a piece of advice or a parting word.
Sure. Yeah. So my book, I'll hold it up. It's easier to just show it. I know not some people are listening. It's called Everything Isn't Terrible: Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. And I also write a weekly newsletter, which is called The Anxious Overachiever, and people can subscribe to that on my website, which is kathleensmith.net. I think we covered so much today. The parting thought that I always have for people when it comes to anxiety, to burnout, is to recognize that our behaviors are adaptive and we do them for a reason. They are not a sign of flaws or being less than, right? It's our sort of task as humans to kind of pay attention to them and ask ourselves, is there a different way of functioning, right? And that's how we slowly grow up over time. So I think the more patience, the more curiosity you can bring to your day-to-day life, I think the better chance you have of maybe not just shifting to what's automatic for you when you get stressed out. So just to go easy on yourself, and to recognize that it happens slowly, but even small changes can make a pretty huge difference.
So give yourself some grace.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us. You have been wonderful. We wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Positively Charged Biz. I'm Laura Brandeo, and we are here to motivate, inspire, and support our listeners as they write their life stories. If you have an inspiring story, please email me at laura@positivelycharged.biz. And remember to subscribe to hear more great guests. and connect to us on Facebook at Positively Charged and Instagram at Positively Charged Podcast. Until next time, we wish you a positive day.